Kia ora, talofa lafa, and welcome to In the Saloon with me, your host, Jane Messer, and our guests, the writer Nic Low and filmmaker and performer Taofia Pelesasa. Today I'm joined by these two remarkable creatives who are shaping the way Pasifika Australians tell stories in Aotearoa, the Pacific and beyond. Nic Low is a Ngāi, Tahu Māori writer, editor and arts organiser whose work explores Indigenous storytelling, history and our relationship with place. His debut short story collection, Arms Race, was shortlisted for major literary prizes, and his best-selling book, Uprising, takes readers on a journey through the Māori history on the Southern Alps of New Zealand. His latest work, Little Doomsdays, co-created with artist Phil Dudson, examines how civilizations prepare for their own demise through arcs, time capsules and burial ships. Nic speaks to us today from Christchurch after many years in Melbourne. Also joining us is Taofia Pelesasa, a multidisciplinary Pasifika Australian creative from Western Sydney. As an actor, writer and screen practitioner, he's worked across Australia, New Zealand, the UK and Samoa. You might recognise him from TV shows like SIS, Court and The Messenger, or from his powerful performances on stage in productions such as The Factory, Black Fagged and At the Wake. His work speaks to the complexities of identity, belonging and representation. I'm thrilled to have both of you here today. Welcome, Nic. Welcome, Taofia.
Hi. Yeah.
Kia ora. Hey there.
Yeah. I'll just say my maloni malolo so for malangi mama. Akatalo hatu hoki ki tato kāinga. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for coming in. So let's dive into a conversation about storytelling, cultural identity, and the power of art. There's so much to talk about, but I thought perhaps we could begin by looking at the story Octopus, which Taofia narrated so powerfully at StorySALOON Live at the Vanguard. I'm going to turn to Nic first because you wrote the story, and I would love to hear about that writing and the history of that. And then in a little bit after that, I think it would be wonderful to hear what it was like hearing Taofia narrate it.
Tēnā koe, Jane, tēnā koe, Taofia. One of the things about being a writer, being any kind of creative, I guess, is that you send your stuff into the world and you don't know where it's going to end up. So to sit in an armchair in my living room and turn on the recording of the performance from the other night and hear your voice, Taofia, kind of fill the speakers and fill the room and hear that story come back to me was just a magical experience. It was incredible. I haven't thought about that story probably in over a decade. Like I wrote it maybe 2011, which was a long time ago. And so to hear those characters brought to life, to hear the voices that I'd had in my head kind of coming at me out the speakers with a decade or more in between was, really quite magic. And not to mention just, on the track being able to hear some of the laughter in the audience, that people were laughing in the bits where I wanted them to laugh. I'm like, oh, it works. It actually works, which is awesome because, when you publish something, you don't necessarily know how it's going to land. You don't get to see the reader's reaction, whether or not they're cracking a smile or they're hurling the book across the room. You'll never really know. So, it was a real privilege to hear it brought to life with such poise and precision and energy. It was fantastic.
Taofia, what was it like reading this story that Nic has written? It's the word I had for it. I don't know what word you had for it, if there was one word, but when I first read it, I just thought, wow, this is so rowdy. It's so strong and rowdy and self-possessed, and I loved it.
It's all those things. I mean, when I was given the script, I read it as soon as I was given it, and as soon as I started reading it, I knew the world instantly from my childhood. And I'm not from the South. I was born in Rotorua. And so the voices of all these boys, I was born in Rotorua, but in a very particular part of that city called Fordlands, but it's colloquially known to locals as the block. And it's called the block because it's the area in the center of the city that people drive around, never through. And so the voices of these boys were so familiar to me. I remember every single version of those characters just from my childhood. And so as soon as I read them, I could hear them. And so I just knew as soon as I read it, I was like, I can do this because it's not too outside of my reality. And even though I'm not Māori myself, I grew up in a very Māori community. I'm the descendant of Tokelauan migrants, and so we were brought over by the New Zealand resettlement scheme in the 60s, and we bypassed the big Pacific populations in Auckland, and my grandparents were planted straight in the middle of the forest of Rotorua from Tokelauan, and so we've, a lot of our identity as my identity as a Pacific person from New Zealand is through the lens of being welcomed to a very particular Māori community. For the first few months of our existence in New Zealand, we lived on Matatua marae. It's where my mother grew up, on a marae, as a Tokelauan woman. And so our identity as Tokelauans is intertwined with the identity of tangata whenua, particularly Te Arawa. So I have a very particular lens to the world of Aotearoa just because of that experience as a child. And having the opportunity to be able to bring a version of my own world through the words of Nic and this amazing short story, Octopus, was an honor. And honestly, I was saying, I texted you yesterday and I just said, thank you for the opportunity, Jane, because up until about, end of last year, I'd been working in the screen industry but behind the scenes as a writer also. And being able to, but I never studied writing, I studied acting. So when I was back on that stage and had those words in my mouth, I had this sudden surge of remembrance around the power of storytelling in that particular way. And so thank you both for the opportunity to do that.
I think, Nic, you probably heard it in Fia's voice, but there was, watching and listening to him perform, there was such a feeling of possession of the story and possession of those characters and their story. Even, as you say, it's not your Māori heritage. And it really affected, you could feel it in the audience. You hear about this, that actors or, performers can feel the room. I wasn't up on the stage with you, but I could feel how connected and listening, how, that the audience were. Nic, did you get a sense of that when you were listening? Because it must be so strange to have heard a story in your head for all that time, and then this other voice takes it on.
I think that's the richness of it, though. One of the things for my process when I'm writing is to read the stories out loud. And in that book, Arms Race, almost every story in that book got a live performance. I really enjoy reading my own work in front of a crowd. And I think that one got a reading. Where I lived in Melbourne for 15 odd years in Brunswick in a big old share house, we had a gap of a couple of months where one of the rooms was going to be empty. And rather than try and find a temporary housemate, we decided to run a speakeasy. So we ran an illegal bar in there for a couple of months. And we had different nights of the week where we had different things on. And we had a little, like a shadow box, like a light box with a blind tiger, an image of a blind tiger. Which was a slang name for a speakeasy. And when the box was lit, people knew the bar was open. And one of the things that we did was we had a readings night. So once a week, we'd invite our friends and people to come and read stories. And, just a bit cheekily, maybe a bit selfishly, it was also a chance for me to road test the stories that I was working on myself. And so I think it was there that I probably read Octopus to a crowd myself. And I went away and edited the story based on that because Fia, you'll know this from your own writing, like you want the hairs on the back of your audience's neck to stand up, right? And when it's happening in the room, you can feel it. And by the same token, when it isn't happening and when they're checking their phones or going for another drink or, staring out the window, then it isn't happening. So it is something that you can kind of sense, and I always go away and rewrite the story based on that feeling of what it's like live in the room. And so to hear it then brought to life in your voice, and, you know, to hear you inhabiting those characters just nailed it for me, because, yeah, the cadences, the rhythms, the laughter, the humor, yeah, it really brought it to life, to hear it in those accents, to hear it. Yeah, so I feel, yeah, I'm just stoked. Like, I know that was kind of a coincidence that you'd grown up on the block in Rotorua, but it just, yeah, I can't think of a better reader to have actually ended up on stage reading that story at that time.
Can we just talk about, I mean, and Fia, leap in with any kind of observations or questions. So apparently, Nic, the story is based originally on a true story, which I'll leave you to retell. So remarkable.
The story is actually based on a series of true stories, none of which, well, I guess, I mean, I don't know if you find this fear when you're writing, but you sort of turn into a magpie, right? Like you're grabbing this from here and this from there and this from there, and you just never quite know how they're going to fit together. But I'm always in this process of recording. I've got a notebook with me at all times. I'm always writing stuff down. And so I think the context for this story was the Rotoki terror raids, where you know, it's a long and complex story, but in a nutshell, there was a major police operation conducted in Te Urewera in Tūhoe country up in the central North Island, and the cops were convinced that there was a major terrorism plot brewing amongst Māori separatists up there, and it led to this enormous and traumatic sting operation where hundreds of armed police raided small communities at gunpoint. And the upshot of this entire thing was a totally traumatized community who were kind of reliving their worst historical nightmares because they'd had similar invasions of colonial troops, you know, 100 or 150 years prior. And then when it actually made its way through the courts, it ended up with prosecutions for, I think, 3 or 4 hunting rifles that were unregistered. So it was a sort of minor firearms transgression as opposed to the kind of end of the world stuff that you know we'd been led to believe was on the cards. So that had been happening, and I'd been paying very close attention to it. Those kinds of politics are something that's, I guess, very central and dear to me. I grew up in a household where we talked about rights and laws on the daily. My mum was one of the first Māori lawyers in Christchurch, and growing up, yeah, this was sort of our daily bread. So I was paying a lot of attention. Then I went on a trip down to Rakiura, Stewart Island, which is my part of the world. I whakapapa to Oraka, Parima, Warua, kind of down in the very bottom of the south of New Zealand. That's where my Māori roots are. And we were going over on the ferry, and there was just some particular weather pattern where the way the light was hitting the water, the way the currents were swirling, there was this enormous kind of blue-purple sphere kind of just, that as we were out there on the ferry, you could see this kind of shape in the water. I've always had an overactive imagination, and I imagined that it was this giant octopus, and that image kind of stayed with me. And then when we got to the pub, we were there drinking, and there was a roading gang on the island. There were these Māori guys who had come over from the mainland, and they got pissed, and they were bored out of their minds, right? Like, this island is really small. There is not a lot to do there. So they knock off work, they go have a few jugs. And what they were actually doing in real life was they'd got their hands on a motorbike, and they were just doing burnouts on the main street. They were driving way too fast and doing donuts and on the wrong side of the road and just having a hell of a good time. Like, there's no other traffic. And we were standing outside the pub, and the local cop comes by, and one of the other guys from the pub's kind of like, are you going to go and speak to them? You know, are you going to just let them do that? And the cop was just like, don't worry about it. I know where they live. I'll catch up with them. And so I think that was another kind of ingredient in the story. And then I think the final piece of the puzzle didn't actually fall into place for me until years later. I wrote that scene where the octopus rises out of the bay, and I think there's a line in the story where I talk about it being like a nuclear submarine rising up underneath them. And I was watching this film called The Navigator. I don't know if you guys have read that. Seen that. It's by Vincent Ward. It's a film from the 80s or 90s. It's a really obscure film, but it was big in New Zealand at the time when I was growing up. Shot in black and white. It's about a medieval village who, in trying to pursue a cure for the plague, go through some kind of mine shaft and come out in 20th century Auckland. And there's this scene in it where they're rowing this tiny boat across a harbour and the submarine just rises up under the boat. And I must have seen that film when I was like 9, and I'd completely forgotten that I'd ever seen that. But then when I saw that scene again, like years after I'd written that story, I'm like, holy shit, that's where that image came from in my head. It was really surreal. And probably the final piece of the puzzle, the final piece of the puzzle is the album based on a true story by Fat Freddy's Drop. It's got a picture of the band in a tiny rowboat with an octopus. I'm like,
say that again.
There was
tell us again what that was. So I didn't quite catch it.
There is a classic band from Aotearoa called Fat Freddy's Drop, and they released an album called Based on a True Story. And the cover of that album was all the band members sitting in a tiny little rowboat with this giant octopus kind of coming up underneath them. So kind of weird how the brain takes these things and puts them together.
You know, that's so funny that you brought up that album cover, because that's the image that I had in my head the entire time that I was reading it. And I'm really familiar with Fat Freddy's Drop because, you know, when you move from New Zealand, you're clinging on to whatever parts of New Zealand that you can, and music is one part of that when you're growing up. But, you know, I love your explanation of the sort of the various inspirations that inspired the work, because to me, if you had not told me that, I would have just believed that there's a local story, like a relative in relation to your iwi, that has to do with an octopus. And you know, and reclamation and sovereignty, and you know, these are all the sorts of words that were coming to me when I was reading it. And also what inspired performance was one of the big things I took away from reading this was that as a Pacific person of color, you know, these ideas, you know, the remnants of colonization are not far from us every day of our lives. And that the hope of reclamation and sovereignty is omnipresent, no matter what. And that the balance for us, and I was giving examples to Jane the other day, of our various Pacific mysticisms versus the Western existence that we live in, are constantly at war with each other. And what I recognized in the boys was they're products of many, many, many years of colonization and there's a lingering hope in them that something will change and that there will be a reclamation, whether they say that explicitly or not. And they do say it explicitly, because Tama's always saying things like Pake they get what they deserve, or I think it was Tama, or you know, other such things. But the octopus to me really represented the boys' hope of some level of reclamation for them and who they are, and that's the version of the story that really resonated with me, was this idea of these boys seeking purpose, and that purpose was through this mythical what do we call it, totem or cultural resurgence. That's literally what the octopus resurging represented to me, was a cultural resurgence and a re-ownership of the things that make us specifically who we are, and for these characters, Māori, you know.
Yeah, koia. No, that is absolutely what the heart of the story was for me as well. I guess what I was talking about before was some of the imagery and the scenarios that kind of fed into it. But yeah, in terms of the political impulse behind it, that is absolutely, what you've just described is very much where I was coming from. And Yeah, so there is also a very particular story about a wheke from that part of the world as well. Like it's a very specific local story to our people. People will know about Te Moana Nui a Kewa. Well, we have Te Ara a Kewa down in our part of the world, which is a story about Rakiura initially was not an island, it was a peninsula. But for various reasons, this annoyed some key people. And so the great wheke, Kewa, kind of munched his way through the isthmus. Oh, sorry, I'm getting thoroughly confused. Oh, no, it's a tohora, it's a whale, not an octopus. I'm kind of conflating my myths. But there is a story of this mythical, enormous, what we would call a tipua,
yes.
A sort of spirit creature that manifests there, and that it's a marker of our identity. And that tipua, Kewa, is the one who created that island in the first place and kind of chewed through the land to create this passageway that opened the passage for our people to go back and forth through what's now called Phobos Strait. So, drawing on that kind of mythical history of that whenua, but also very much that sense of cultural revitalization and resurgence, that for me is absolutely what the wheke, what the octopus rising up represented. This kind of hope. And I think what I was also kind of grappling with at that time was what form that hope should take, because, with the rotoke, with those raids and with the kinds of conversations that had been recorded by the cops, there was, violence was in the room, and there was this sense of armed struggle potentially being a solution. And so I wanted to kind of just to try to think about how, if you end up, when you're young and you don't have power in a literal sense, what kind of dreams or fantasies or fears do you have, and how do they rise up? What are these kind of things that Pākehā are so scared of, that there's going to be this resurgence that on the one hand is something beautiful and to be proud of, but for others it's seen as something that's violent and fearful. So I don't think I had a kind of concrete message about that, but that's the sort of milieu I guess I was exploring.
I mean, that's definitely the messaging I got, and I'm sure the audience got too.
I mean, what's remarkable about a short story, like as the form and why we're doing StorySALOON and working with short stories, is that you can create a short story, which I think took less than 20 minutes for you, Fia, to read aloud. And it's this whole world, and it takes you through so many ideas and emotions, and yet it's just a story. Like, my first impression was, this is comedic, it's rowdy, it's lively. I was looking for works for a live performance. But then there's all this depth of history, and each of the characters is sort of individual, and yet they're also, culturally representative, and they're grappling with big questions about, do I believe in the octopus? Like, what is the octopus? Is it myth? Is it real? Is it both? Do I listen to my father, who tells me, to be guided by what I know, that I'll recognize what I know? Like, there's all this very serious matter in the story, and yet the art, of course, is that you're just carried along. It's just, shit happens, one thing after another, and it's full of surprises. And this is when a short story is brilliant, when it's many things all at once, but it feels really simple to experience it. And then you can think about it later and think, oh yeah, but there was that element and that element and that element. How does that all fit together?
I think too, also it's if you're familiar with those sorts of characters, and also just Māori humor in particular, like and people who are growing up in that particular world, when there's struggle, you don't know there's struggle because everyone's mucking around, the whole entire time. Humor is such a huge part of how these sort of disenfranchised communities deal with the sufferings and the things that they're dealing with in life. And, why those characters were so recognizable to me is, it's that I know that life, and that laughter is actually, and mucking around and just like being a clown is just the best way to get through those sort of, these sort of disenfranchising sort of things. But what I love about the way that the short story is, invites us into a world that is sometimes inaccessible to audiences outside ourselves. And I think that's absolutely in the writing, is that you were so true to the world that but that world became you made it so accessible to people who might not be 100% familiar, as far as, to an audience that think Māori are just doing a haka, is about doing the haka at the All Blacks. That actually there are so many layers to te ao Māori and to everything that makes them who they are, make you guys who you are. So yeah, I will say just one thing too. When I was preparing, I was like, okay, so I've never really read a short story out loud. Do I approach it like a monologue, or do I it's actually finding the fine line between, because really what the difference between a monologue and I guess reading a short story out loud is, a monologue you have full reign to just sort of take the words and put it in your mouth and speak it, whereas with the short story, I was more concerned about honoring the intention of the writer in that case, and that you are essentially reading prose with dialogue in it, and how you tread the line between trying to do an Oscar-worthy winning performance without losing the story, and so, I mean, hopefully I had done that, but that was also my goal too, was just to not overwhelm the text with my performance, but still find the nuances.
I felt that the story's in first person. So it's the I, you're narrating a particular man speaking. I felt you really inhabited him so well, and that sort of mix of confidence and uncertainty, and moments where he relaxed, and then moments when he was on alert, and, when those scary moments when the police turn up and there's beams on them. I thought you inhabited that voice remarkably well.
I'm glad.
I was glad.
A kind of I was glad too. There's a kind of truism within the writing world that if your book or story ever makes its way across onto the stage or into TV or film, you're best to step away. You're actually best to recognize that it's going to become something new, that it will take on its own life, and that the people who then take it on and transform it, that's their medium and they know it better than you do. So I was stoked to like, I think you absolutely honored the text and the intention behind it. I'm also up for interpretations, as a general rule, because having been kind of schooled in that approach. And Arms Race, that book got optioned for TV twice. It never made it any further than that. But just, in the conversations with my publisher and with our rights manager and various other people who had gone through that process, they were like, yep, just hand it over and walk away. That's kind of the best for everything, for everyone. Can I just quickly pick up on one other thing that you said before, Thea? That sense of communicating your people and your community to a wider audience. It's something that I've always found a challenge and a kind of fascinating challenge working in Australia and writing about the Māori world, and trying to find that line between all the cultural references and the histories and the things that, if I was talking about them in Aotearoa, you wouldn't have to spell it out. You wouldn't have to explain that. Whereas in Australia, just sort of walking that line to give enough context, enough history, so that people can stay in the story, but that you're also not like smashing them over the head with exegesis and too much of that. So, I mean, I don't know if with your own writing, if you're bringing Pasifika lives and characters and worlds to the screen, whether those are considerations for you as well.
Oh, they're 100%. It's funny. I was saying earlier, I work sort of half between Australia, half between New Zealand, and my experience as a Pacific storyteller is very different in both countries, even though we're right next to each other. But the benefit I have when I go to New Zealand as a Pacific creative is that there are generations of Pacific creatives above me who really created infrastructure for us to exist. And so all we need to do in my generation is make the work, because it's already been put in place. And so there I'm a student, I'm still learning. And because there are elders above me. In Australia, I don't have that. And so Pacific and Māori, Pasifika and Māori creatives in this country, we're the elders and the students at the same time. And it is quite a hard thing to reconcile, because we are all, I feel like I'm just a fetus. But I have no elders above me who have done that work, and I don't blame them. Like, for what reason? They had no reason to contribute, to enter the art scene, because there was Australia gave them no reason to believe that they could here. Whereas the way that New Zealand has opened and invited Pacific people to create industry, they benefit from it now, because you can just see Pacific work being pummeled out of New Zealand. Whereas here we are just on the start line, and so my approach to the way that I create Pacific work here versus New Zealand is very different, because here you have to always be aware of the way that you tell work, because you don't want to really screw it up for the people after you, because you're aware you're right at the beginning. And so you do have to do a lot of really explaining what the Pacific is to people first and foremost. And then, here in New Zealand, you can differentiate the different Pacific Islanders. People know the difference between a Tongan and a Samoan and a Tokelauan, but in Australia, they don't at all. And so I have to take all of that into mind when I'm writing Pacific content in this country, which I take as a challenge. To me, it's a badge of honor to be part of the pioneer generation of artists who are Pacific in Australia. And so, you just have to accept that the benefits of the fruits of the plants that you seed now are going to benefit someone down the line, just like we're benefiting from the plants that were planted by the generations in New Zealand. So it's when you approach it that way, it's beautiful. But yeah, you're right. It's a difficult task, but I take it as an honor to at least contribute, so it makes it a little bit easier for the ones after us.
It's one of the reasons that I'm actually back in Aotearoa at the moment, because I experienced something very similar. Like, myself and a couple of mates, some of my relations, we started what's called a taurehire group, so a kind of an expat group of Ngāi Tahu in Melbourne. There's about 600 Tahus in Melbourne, which is a pretty decent number. And so about once a fortnight, we'd get together for te reo Māori lessons. We'd regularly bring over some of our experts and elders and leaders from Aotearoa to teach whakapapa, teach genealogy, teach history, teach traditional arts. And there was a real richness to that to keep people connected, but it put me in a really uncomfortable position in that I was a tuakana, like I was an elder and a figure and a leader in that space, and I felt thoroughly unqualified to be in that space because, come back into this context in Aotearoa, I'm a baby, right? So part of me being back here at the moment is for our son to go to kura here so he can be in a Māori immersion school. Part of it is also for myself to throw myself in the deep end there, to go from being a kind of not qualified sort of teacher to being a student. So I'm doing kind of more advanced level immersion te reo at night school around the writing work, and just sort of sitting at the feet of our elders and trying to absorb as much as I can. It's exactly as you say, Fia, that there are the generations stretching back here that are ready to teach when you come to the point where you're ready to learn.
I'm slightly jealous.
I would like...
Hey, flights are cheap.
Can we turn... because I just wanted to pick up on some conversations, Fia, that we've had about your work in Fiji, and I know this is something Nic will be thinking about too, about global warming and, the sea rising and the very real threats to island communities, and what you're doing with collecting and nurturing stories?
Yeah, that's a big question, Jay.
I know you can talk about
that's
it.
That's a big one.
Because you have talked about it.
Yeah, the more I spend time in the industry, as it is, as we've been told to accept it, the more I realize it's not really exactly the way that I would like to tell a story. It doesn't 100% isn't attuned to the person that I am and the culture I come from. And so I've did, a lot of my approach at the moment to the industry and work is essentially to find a new way that is more sustainable for me as a Pacific person without compromising the stories that I care for. And I think a lot of that, I have the weird benefit of being half Samoan, half Tokelauan. Samoans, everyone knows who Samoans are. They're quite a dominant Pacific culture, and even as a Samoan myself, I would dare say we take up too much space. But as a Tokelauan, no one knows who we are. And so I have been able to view the Pacific and its stories from two very different vantage points. And, there are a lot of Samoan artists there, so I really try and devote my life to to escalating the stories of Tokelau. Now, Tokelau is one of the smallest countries in the world, not just the Pacific. It has a population of about 2,000 people, and 80% of the population was shifted off the islands by the New Zealand government in the 60s. And so, because it was already going. And one play I wrote at university was this play called Te Molimau, which means the offertory, and it's set in the last hour of Tokelau being above water. And so it's, there's sort of two stories happening in tandem. One is about a Tokelauan girl who's been left in Tokelau till the last moment, like a captain doesn't leave a ship. And an Australian-born Tokelauan journalist who's been sent there to sort of cover it and who has this detachment from the island because he grew up in Australia. And then there's the story that's happening in tandem is an Aboriginal flight attendant who is bringing an elderly Tokelauan woman to Australia to resettle her. And so in that story, in that thread, you have an Aboriginal woman who technically has the land but has no language or culture, and you have this old Tokelauan woman who has the reverse, who has the language and her culture but not the land. And so these interesting discussions around home and identity and what that means. And I think why I approach for me, the climate story discussion is all about numbers and all about percentages and all about the science, which I get, that's important. But what people really don't think about is what happens to us. What happens to Tokelauan people and the culture when when the waka of our culture is gone, where do we go and how do we identify ourselves when the physical place is no longer there? And that is my concern, in the sense that me and a few generations after will always know Tokelau, even if it's gone in our lifetime, we'll still know it because it was there at one point that we knew. But in 10 generations' time, Tokelau, every Tokelauan in the world will be existing in a world that they never knew it existed. Tokelau ever existed to them. And to me, that's such a confronting thing to have to think about, is generations of Tokelauan. Like, what do you cling to at that point? So a lot of my work at the moment is really about preservation of story and preservation of story now. We can build seawalls and we can do all that stuff, but actually it's quite an urgent call to action, which is we need to start preserving story. And so I just came back from Fiji maybe 2 weeks ago, and I am sort of running programs in the Pacific where I am teaching young filmmakers about taking their climate stories from their specific realities and sort of teaching them the process of putting those stories on page and bringing them to life. So I'll go back in July and we'll shoot them in Fiji, and then presenting them at COP next year. So, which is the climate change conference that they have, where they all sit around and talk about the same stuff every second year. And actually humanize the experience of the climate emergency, which I feel like is what the failure is with that discussion. So yeah, I mean, that's me.
Yeah, I would have to say, when I was preparing for this conversation, I just thought, will I ever have two such interesting creatives, writers, performers, filmmakers in the booth again? Because both, I mean, we have to wrap up now, but I know. It's just been such an interesting conversation, and I think that what both of you are doing is so important. I would love to have you back both to the podcast. We have to do it. We will do it. Thank you. Thank you, Nic Low, and thank you, Taofia Pelesasa.
Right back at you. All right. Pō Māori a kōrua. Good night.
Pō Māori.
You've been listening to an episode of In the Saloon with. Your host has been Jane Messer, recording by Martin Gallagher, along with sound design, with additional audio engineering by Finn Walker. A big thanks to the whole Story Saloon team.